My name is Talese, and I'm the author most recently of a book called A Writer's Life, which Knopf published in 2006. I wasn't given any advice. I wasn't even aware of writers during most of my life until I came to New York at the age of 21 after college. What made me a writer is what made me curious. And what made me curious was being an American that wasn't sure how American I was. I think this is true of a lot of people who have foreign parents. And my mother and father ran a store in the southern part of New Jersey where I was born. The town is called Ocean City. I was born in 1932. When I was 10 years old, the war, World War II, was very much being enacted through the European theater. And the part of Italy that my parents come from, which is the southern part, was being attacked by Allied forces, Americans and Canadians and British, moving up through the areas that were the centers of my ancestry. Though I was born in New Jersey, as I said before, I was 10 years old, 11 years old, 12 years old during that 1942, 43, 44 period. And the only thing I remember that made me a writer, and the curiosity that is necessary, I think, for being the kind of writer I am, a nonfiction writer, was that as a boy in the store, I would see my parents react during the daytime in one manner as they dealt with customers. My mother spoke English very well. My father spoke English with an accent, and he worked in the back of the store, and my mother worked in the front of the store selling dresses. And what started me thinking about other people was when I overheard conversations between my mother and her customers. And I became very curious about the women and their stories. My listening to the stories as women on one end of the counter would talk across the counter to my mother in those leisurely afternoons while browsing through the clothing racks, picking fabric or picking dresses to try on, they would be talking about things. And the things that they'd be talking about weren't necessarily of any significance in a social or historical sense, but they were revealing of personal moods, personal feelings. And during the war, there was references to the war, to the rationing of food, to the lack of gasoline during that period, to the fear of their sons or maybe daughters in the military service, or their uncles or fathers working in defense plants late at night in faraway Philadelphia, which is 50 miles away. And so as a boy, I was hearing references to the war while being remote from the war. And at the same time, I was intimately involved with the enemy in the war, the Italians, who of course were allied with the Germans, because my father's three brothers were in the Italian army. Now you say, what does this have to do with being a writer? What this has to do with being a writer is this. At a young age, I would eavesdrop in the store and hear stories of American women talking about their lives. The kind of material that might make, for fiction writers, the essence of fiction, private life. At night, I would hear in our apartment above the store is closed at 7 o'clock, 6:30. I would hear my father, who wasn't very vocal during the day, talking very much about his fear of his brother's welfare and the village itself where his widowed mother, lived. And I was getting, at this young age, a sense of story and how in this little building with the store on the first floor and the apartment on the second floor, the emergence of characters and the changing personality between the day and the night. The father who was reticent during the day, no doubt interiorly very defensive and possibly insecure in his sense of being pro-American. And at night, more outspoken because there weren't any customers that he had to worry about being overheard what he was saying. I was just interested in a story here. Now, what was the story? The story is no story in a way, but it's a full story of character, inquiry, promoting my curiosity. Patience, the most important thing, as you perhaps in the beginning, is definitely curiosity. The ability to be outside yourself, to see other people and wonder who are they? How are they different from me? How do they get through the day and night? What motivates them? Where do they come from? Where do their parents come from? All this curiosity about people. Next thing is to get to bridge the ignorance gap and get to talk to these people. I have that. That again comes out of the store. Anybody in your audience who had parents who had a store, kids who hang around stores because their parents are the proprietors or because the kids have a job in a store, learn at an early age to deal with people of many different ages. As a kid, I would see older people coming into the store. I would hear them talk. I would watch the way they moved, what they dressed, how they looked, how they comported themselves. So I'm dealing with different age groups. Also in stores, you have to have good manners. That's another thing I picked up very quickly, and it helps in journalism, I think. Good manners, store manners. You always have to be respectful toward the customer. My parents certainly, that was a mandate in their little business that I certainly followed. What you need as well as curiosity and being able to engage people and be polite and presentable and therefore make yourself acceptable to strangers in the beginning. You have to have patience. Many journalists, many writers, many curious people are curious but not patient enough in taking the time, properly the amount of time, not pushing it, to patiently court the people that they want, that the writer wants to know about, that I, in this case, would want to know about. I'm never in a rush. I take very long time in my research, and it never is interrupted with note-taking and tape recording. I never do any of that. What I do is try to introduce myself most deferentially to people I'm curious about. I tell them with sincerity that I'm interested in them and why. And I am sincerely interested in these people because they represent to me something I believe is an enlargement of my life. These people are different from me. I am interested in describing the difference. I'm also interested in bringing to the printed page, their stories. Why? Because I'm searching for material. The material I search is reality, real people. But most particularly, people who are not making the news, people who are not well known. I've always wanted to be writing about people that the reader perhaps heard about for the first time because I wrote about them. I was very different myself. And I think that a writer, many writers, whether you're talking about the great fiction writers, Philip Roth, or the late John Updike, or the late William Styron, I mean, they very much present something of the in the case of Roth particularly, the outsider. And I was in the world of nonfiction very much in the persona of the outsider, from that boy in the store to the boy at Alabama. And I'd write little stories for the college newspaper, as I'd written little stories I didn't mention in the town weekly, the New Jersey Town Weekly. I would write school news. I'd write about my fellow students in grade school and high school, and later on when I was at college, the same. And I wasn't writing fiction. I wanted to write nonfiction because I thought that there wasn't much difference between fiction and nonfiction, except in fiction, you imagined stories and you changed the names of living people that might have inspired the stories. In nonfiction, which I wanted to do, and did do, and do, I thought, I want to write stories, but I don't want to change the names. That's the big difference between what I do and a fiction writer does. And maybe a big difference between the nonfiction that I advocate and advance and personify from the nonfiction that is strictly journalism. It isn't journalism, what I'm doing. It is stories about real people and real names. I insist on real names. I never make up information. What I do is spend an inordinate amount of time with the people I write about. But my ambition is to try to describe realistically the life of people, particularly private people, ordinary people, the sort of people who went to my mother's dress shop when I was a boy, observing and eavesdropping. I was really motivated then, as I still am now at the age of 77, to write about people that you might not have ever heard of, but perhaps through my efforts as a writer, my descriptive efforts, my ambitions as a writer of scenes and visual writing, you will see them, and you will see them, and you will understand them, and you will get a sense of the people that it took me a long time to know, but now I want to communicate them to you. And that's really what I do. It's very difficult. Sometimes, in my, my senior years and a lot of work in print, I'm asked to go to colleges to teach a class or speak before students of nonfiction writing. And they ask a lot of questions, and how did you do this, and how did you do that? And I tell them, but sometimes I think to myself, how are these people going to get a job? And while these people are very interested and eager and certainly attentive to what I am saying in these classroom sessions, I wonder how they're ever going to do it, because the life has changed. In the year 2009, it's not at all like it was in 1959 when I started writing for magazines. And I kept writing for magazines from the 1960s into the 70s. That piece on Frank Sinatra was published in 1966. And when I did that piece, Esquire was the publisher. They sent me out to California. They put me in a very fine hotel, the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills, California. I was able to rent a car. I was able to have an expense account and take people to lunch, to dinner, and I kept careful records, of course. I always have, of what I spend, because I'm to be reimbursed and I want to be very accurate about it. And there was never, even when I was not getting the cooperation that it was expected I would, because it was expected I would get an interview, but I never got an interview. But I still stayed out there and talked to all these minor people that I mentioned earlier. And never did the editor say, oh, listen, you better come home. I actually volunteered when I was staying in the Beverly Wilshire. It was the third or fourth day. I was aware that maybe I should move to a cheaper hotel, find a place. I was going to spend a lot of time out there. It turns out I spent about 4 weeks in Beverly Hills, just research. And I'd asked the editor if he wanted me to look for a hotel room that wouldn't be so expensive. And he said, no, stay where you are. Now, that wouldn't happen now. But a lot of things have happened that make life for young writers who would like to do what I used to do. But it's so changed. The technology, I think, has had a ruinous effect. It started with the tape recorder. That was number one. The worst thing ever happened to nonfiction, serious nonfiction writing, was the tape recorder. What this did was allow reporters or magazine writers to use Q&A techniques, question and answer, to take a tape recorder, and in rather not much time at all, to get a lot of verbatim quotes from well-known people. Magazines prefer to have well-known people when they put them on the cover. Usually they're movie stars or well-known people in aspects of political life. And the tape recorder allows a reporter to go to a hotel room, for example, and interview a movie star. And with a matter of about an hour, we'll get enough for an article. And then go back and write it using a lot of direct quotes. Some of these quotes I said earlier aren't quotes that I would want to use, because it doesn't necessarily mean what people have in their heads. It's rather what they're coming out of their mouths. These extended sound bites is what they're getting. And also, I think in the process of having a tape recorder, they brought the whole format of the magazine article indoors, because the tape recorder is done indoors. Most of the pieces that I wrote, and still would write if I was able to do what I want to do, would be outdoors. I travel with people. My technique is hanging out with people. When I wrote about Sinatra, I was never indoors with him. I was watching him in the studio. I described it when he was recording. I watched him taking walks in Las Vegas as he went from casino to casino, the scenes of his gambling, going to a prize fight in Las Vegas. They were big scenes, and they were outdoors, and they were very descriptive, and they told the reader what it was like to be there. It wasn't this narrow question answer. And the owners of magazines, the publisher or the editor or the owner, are very interested in cost cutting, of course. And the tape recorder played right into that. Moreover, it would be to the advantage of the publisher of a magazine to have things directly on quote with tape recorder to verify, so that the lawyers would be able to fight off any challenge in terms of misquotation, libel suits. So that was another contribution to the cost-cutting emphasis that was brought by editors upon the writing process. What you have now, with the exception of some great, like a great magazine like the New Yorker, as an exception, but what you have now is nothing of the kind of art of the magazine piece that I and many others of my generation used to practice. We had expense accounts. See, also that tape recorder meant that you didn't have to send people out to the other side of the United States. You could wait for the movie star or the singing star, the rock star, to come to New York, performing at Madison Square Garden, staying at the Pierre Hotel or the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, of the Plaza Hotel or wherever they're staying, and you send somebody over there with a tape recorder, and then they over an hour or so they'll get a lot of quotes. So the magazine piece is not a work of art anymore. I had no desire ever to marry. I feared marriage, to tell you the truth. Ironically, the marriage that I knew, the marriage I knew best was my parents' marriage, which was a very healthy, wonderful marriage. 60 years. But I thought the marriage, my parents being partners in the business, having a store, I told you, were very close in day and night. It was almost claustrophobically close. And they had only 2 children. I was the firstborn, and there was a daughter born 4 years after me. So the 4 of us were in this very tight family, in these very tight quarters. My parents were so compatible, almost at the expense of their children. And I felt that the marriage they had was just too close and suffocatingly so. There's no freedom there. They were under the gun. I mean, my mother and father were rarely out of sight of one another. My father never would make trips without my mother. They're together all the time. This togetherness was obsessive. Or at least I felt so. So I felt I never want to be so linked to another person. I wouldn't have a sense of adventure or exploration, or the option of doing things on my own without necessarily announcing in advance what I wanted to do. I wanted my ambition as a young boy was to travel freely, not to have an itinerary, not to be committed. Not to be committed, that's one of the major things, to a person or to a situation, not to be dependent. I wanted freedom. Journalism afforded that. I mean, of all the occupations, if I were a doctor, I wouldn't be free out of it, the confinement of the career of being a physician or anything. I wanted to be free. I wanted to write about other people, to escape. A lot of escape is in my mentality, the desire to escape into other people's stories. That's all a matter of getting outside yourself. Not important. You know what's really important? It's more important than love? Respect. What keeps a marriage together is not love. What keeps a marriage, or what keeps a relationship together, whether it's marriage or relationship outside of marriage, a committed relationship, it's respect. No one can define love. Just like no one, sometimes people associate sex with love. You know, boy, I'm in love, I'm in love. You can be in love in a way that you can maybe convince yourself is a definition that subscribes, that is particular to you. But it's very vague. What is not very vague is respect. If you don't have respect for a person, especially a spouse, there's no way that relationship can survive. Respect. You lose respect for a person, it's all over. They could be the sexiest person, the most beautiful person, the greatest sexual mate. They could perform, all the acts of physical love in ways unmatched in the universe. But if there's no respect, if there's a limited respect or not great amounts of respect, it's over. It's over. Sex is not important in a good marriage. No, you want to know more? Ask me a better question, but it's true. Sex is not important. Sex is very temporarily important in the beginning, because the quest for companionship and compatibility is certainly fostered by active and fulfilling sexual experience. Absolutely true. Sex is in the beginning of the mating game, very important. Sex is the allure of a woman who can, through sexual appeal, attract a man who is attracted to her because she's sexy, because in bed she's very, very fulfilling. But that's okay for a while. That's not going to carry you through years. Oh, the only thing that's going to carry you through years is being compatible with the person, having a lot in common, shared values, and I keep repeating, respect for one another. That is it. Without that, without respect, the game is over. I think what kept the marriage together during times of stress, and there were certainly many times of stress, as in any relationship, and certainly in our kind of marriage there was, because I was traveling a lot. My research, I would go all over the place, sometimes to other countries. I'm well beyond my Frank Sinatra experience. There were times when I go live in Italy for 2 or 3 years when I started writing long books. After my magazine career ended, I was writing books exclusively, and some of them would take me 5 or 6 years to research. 4 or 5 books that I wrote from the 1960s to the 2006, that last, were books of 7 or 8 years of being on the road while staying married. The reason it wasn't so stressful for my wife, Nan, with whom I've been married now 50 years. In 2009, we were married in 1959, and 50 years is this year. One of the reasons is that it wasn't so stressful. She always had a full-time career. She could, no less than me, fulfill herself in her work. Her work became, as she became older and more skilled, recognized. There are books now called Nan Talese books. Nan Talese books / Doubleday. And she's got her own career. Her writers are among the best. There's Margaret Atwood. There's Ian McEwan. There's Antonia Fraser, there's Pat Conroy, there's Barry Unsworth. There's all kinds of distinguished literary writers that are published under her imprint. And so it isn't like she's ever lived through me. She was never just Gay Talese's wife. Never. I mean, she would mind. I don't mean to suggest that she's very publicity hungry or that she needs reassurance by having her name on the product, but she happens to have her name on the product, her books. So she's had her independence. And it was so different from my mother and father, who were people in the store and day and night within reach of one another and scrutiny of one another. And I had a lot of freedom from the beginning and through the 50 years. And I think that's kept this marriage together. No, I think that from the time I was young to even now, the idea that the novel is the big desirable beast, and Mailer used to call it the beast, the novelist. I think that the great writers, more often than not, are fiction writers, because the fiction writer has the capacity to imagine, to make up things. And the nonfiction writer, the historian or the current events writer or the journalist, the essayist, are restricted by having to be truthful and also verifiably truthful. But I believe that you can counter this and not be restrained by the form of nonfiction and the limitations of nonfiction and having to be truthful. You can overcome this by spending more time. I'm not myself very, very prolific as a writer. I'm in my 77 years, I've written 5 long books. I've had 2 short books and 4 collections. Meaning I'm not a lazy man. I've written a lot. But for the amount of time I spend writing and researching, there are people who've written 3 times as much as I have. But I take a lot of time because I want to have a lot of time with my characters, because all the time I spend, I get to know my characters better. I get to know them inside themselves because of the time I take in knowing them. It's a kind of courtship you mentioned. It's a kind of relationship is very personal. I'm very personally engaged in my work and the people I'm writing about. And as a result, I can write with a freedom since I know well what I'm writing about, who I'm writing about, that borders very closely upon fiction writers who are making it up. I'm not making it up, but I sound like I'm making it up, which is what I want to achieve. The lack of believability initially on the part of the reader, wondering, how does this guy know this much? Does he make it up? No, I didn't make it up. I just knew it very well. And that took a lot of time, though. And patience, that word I use again. Curiosity, and then patience, capacity to hang out, and to write about ordinary people as if they were, in the imagination of a fiction writer, extraordinary. Willy Loman is a great character, a minor character. But in the hands and in the imagination of the great playwright Arthur Miller, Willy Loman is an international figure, played on the stages of the world. Death of a Salesman is around the world, in many languages, performed every week. A minor character, but not minor when you get a great play and a great writer like Miller to write about. That book dealt with a lot of things. Censorship, what was immoral by the standards of that time, meaning the 1970s and 80s. What is on today in 2009, anything goes. You just have to know to look at a different place for it. When I was researching in the 1970s to do that book that was published in 1980, the aforementioned Dinever's Wife, things were very visual on the streets. You could see massage parlors. If you walked up Lexington Avenue, Park Avenue even, all over the cities, major cities of the United States, for example, you would find massage parlor signs, massage. Very open. There were newspapers, such as the pornographic newspapers would advertise. Massage parlors were really little more than places of prostitution. I mean, you would pay women to perform sexual acts upon yourself. It might be masturbation, it might be oral sex, it might be intercourse. But what happened after that AIDS period, now the internet offers everything. Massage parlors are on the internet. If you know how to use the internet, there's nothing you can't get. Swingers, mate swapping, as I said, the most hardcore pornography is available. So there's no. What you see, when I started to research that book some quarter century and more ago, there was a kind of a moral squad of people who wanted to restrict the right of adults to have access to sexual dalliance. Right now you can't control it because what's happened through the technology of the internet is it brought the merchandising of sex into the home, and people can just sit there on their laptop and order whatever they want. I mean, it's like it's easy as takeout. I mean, it's like going to Kentucky Fried Chicken or having pizza sent in. You can get everything. No, it's always been possible. No, I don't mean that. You could always go out and get sex anyway. That's nothing new. There's very little new about sex. There's very little new. It's just different ways of merchandising and different ways of obtaining it. If we're talking about mercenary sexuality, that's what you are talking about. Now, let's talk about marital sexuality. I said before, and I repeat now, marriages are not going to be held together because of sexual performance. You see all these Viagra. God, you can barely watch a football game without having 16 Viagra commercials interrupt between every exchange of football. That's nice. I mean, it's great that there's such a thing for impotent men as for Viagra and all those other competing products. But again, marriages are not going to be held together because of sexual performance. It's not. I mean, the beginning, as I said, the courtship period, okay, that's a phase. But the sexiest woman alive is not going to be a marital mate of any consequence if her mate doesn't respect her. I mean, or the other way around. No, in my way, when I was young, I do remember there were a lot of drinkers who were known to be good writers. a lot of the great writers when I was a kid, the names like William Faulkner was a big drinker, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who was one of my favorite writers when I was a young man and reading fiction for the first time, was a notorious drinker, and his wife, and then the whole. There was a celebration of alcoholism almost within the creative arts, and also even in journalism. I remember my first time in the city room of the New York Times. I remember one time, one job I had was working late on what they call the rewrite desk. I was where you're in a rewrite bank of typewriters, and people call in information. Well, some of those rewrite men, excuse me, some of them were so drunk. One time I saw a man whose head fell on his typewriter. This is in the center of the New York Times, and he was just out from the drinking. He had a bottle in his drawer. I remember when I was a sports writer, one of the jobs I had in my early career was working in the sports department. One time I was sent out to Arizona to cover the New York Giants baseball team on the year it moved from New York to San Francisco to become the San Francisco Giants. They trained in Tucson or Phoenix, Arizona. I think it was. And I remember I met sports writers from other newspapers, and there was a sports writer for the New York News and a sports writer for the New York Mirror, which used to be a tabloid in New York. And these two guys who covered the New York Giants, and I was doing it for the New York Times, these two guys were pals, and one of them was a heavy drinker, a big drinker. His name was Jim McCullough. And the guy that is pal from the Mirror is named Kent Smith. Kent Smith, because McCullough always get drunk before the game was over, would write both stories. He would write a story for the New York Mirror, and then he would write under the name Jim McCullough another story to cover up for his friend. His friend was never he was never sober enough to get into the game to write what happened. I mean, this was incredible. I couldn't believe that this is a journalism, the journalism that abounded in my time, and the presence of alcohol that was part of it. There's nothing like that today. City room in those days when it was full of smokers. The whole room was full of smoke. And drinking, they think that now there's a big series on television called Mad Men, about the advertising agency life of the 1960s and 70s. The drinking went on in journalism was beyond that. Lunches at, it was drunken people all over. It's a wonder the paper could ever get out. There were enough sober people, at least for every issue, to get a paper out, but another half of the staff was out of it. Well, sometimes I wear clothes that are made for me by tailors. And then sometimes I go to special stores where I like the merchandise. Now, this jacket I'm wearing is, I have a favorite store in Paris. I sometimes go to Paris once a year at least, and I always go to the store. It's called Francesco Smalto, S-M-A-L-T-O. And this is a Smalto jacket. I purchased often things from there. I like the cut, very continental cut, very distinguished. It's the finest off-the-rack tailoring you can get, I think. Now, the tailoring I usually wear are clothes that are made for me by relatives of mine who are also in Paris. My cousins, Cristiani, and Francis Cristiani, Antonio Cristiani. Their father was the elder Antonio, was a mentor to my father. They're Italians who went to Paris, in the case of the old Cristiani, in 1911. And they had a shop for 50 years on the Rue de la Paix, and they made all my clothes. So I have and I have tailor-made clothes from other people. The tie is certainly not made for me. I go to special places to have the ties. I have a tailor that I know, and I live in the east side of Manhattan. And there's a shop that sells ties that I go to and have shirts also made. The shirt maker is called Addison on Madison, but they're not on Madison. They used to be. They've now moved to a private place. The store is no longer on the street. They have a little back business, but I get all my shirts made for me. No, what keeps me up late at night or watching a baseball game when the Yankees are on the West Coast. That's about it.